Hi guys, welcome to Novum and welcome to what's hopefully going to be a pretty interesting dip into the world of conspiracy. Although I'm worried to some of you it may sound completely insane. I'm sure there's going to be at least some pushback, so just let me confirm that I have researched this very carefully. I've studied Frankenstein in depth in several different academic settings, and as far as I can tell, this is all legitimate. It's not well covered at all in comparison to the mountain of analysis that exists on all the other aspects of Frankenstein. It's mostly fleeting mentions in other broader or narrower analysis. But it is legitimate, no matter how incredible or silly it may seem at first. And with this video, I hope to cement that argument for good. So fans of conspiracy, fans of incredible literature, and fans of horror in general, I really hope there's going to be something for you here. Now, we've all heard of the Illuminati, the idea of a shadowy zeitgeist controlling world events and cultural interactions from behind the scenes. And I'm sure those more historically inclined among you will know that the Illuminati was, at one point in the late 1700s in Bavaria, 100% a very real thing going by that exact name. Founded by Adam Weishaupt, the group was essentially a quasi-Masonic lodge made up of Weishaupt students, influential figures from around Bavaria, and various academics and Enlightenment-era thinkers. Relatively benign during their tenure, but with vast and perhaps misguided aspirations of forcing change onto the world. They were the very definition of a secret society. At their peak, they were comprised of somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 members, and before long, their notoriety and sometimes alarming motivations became well known enough that the Bavarian authorities decided to entirely outlaw the Order of Illuminism, threatening anyone that continued in its practices with execution. Adam Weishaupt lived out the rest of his days in shame and exile, writing apologist manuscripts for the Illuminati and the mistakes he made. If you want a slightly more detailed refresher on everything that went down there and everything Adam Weishaupt did, then you can check out the video I just put up on my second channel, link at the top of the screen. For now though, that word enlightenment is really important. The Enlightenment essentially refers to the period of advancement and learning seen in Europe and America between 1680 and 1820, specifically the flourishing of arts and sciences and the championing of academia and cultural development. The idea of illumination being symbolic for knowledge is likely as old as stories themselves. In ancient Greece, for example, Prometheus' stolen knowledge from the gods was represented as fire, a literal interpretation of illumination. And this makes sense. The dark represents the unknown, the unseen, and so light naturally represents the known. In the case of artificial or created light, i.e. Promethean fire or a light bulb above the head, illumination generally refers to attained knowledge, education, and discovery, or specifically stealing it from the gods in Prometheus' case. So enlightened thinkers, illuminated thinkers, it's all synonymous. Adam Weishaupt was absolutely a product of this enlightenment. In fact, in his very high opinion of himself, he was the evolution of it. He was raised on enlightenment philosophy from as young an age as 5 and started a secret society of intellectuals literally called the Illuminated Ones. And somewhere between reading Immanuel Kant at 5 years old and creating the blueprint for global domination later in life, Adam began researching the occult, esoteric accounts, and obscure spiritual texts. And when I first heard about that, reading about Adam and how he locked himself away in his study in Ingolstadt, burrowing into writings on the occult, it occurred to me that that is exactly what Victor Frankenstein did, in exactly the same place, Ingolstadt, Bavaria, at a very similar time in history. And that sparked my interest because Frankenstein is pretty much as perfect as books get. As far as my top 3 goes, it's that, Dracula, and 1984 in no particular order. While an argument should be made that Frankenstein is equal parts romanticism as much as it is a product of the Enlightenment, the fact of the matter is that it doesn't define romanticism like it does the Enlightenment. For me at least, Frankenstein is the essential Enlightenment text, even if it comes from this framework of romantic Gothic literature. It's a cautionary tale of unchecked science and a masterful patchwork of anxieties that mark the end of the Enlightenment era, man's reach outweighing his grasp and what it means to be human. And to cut a long story short, it's a metaphor for the Illuminati. To give the book its full title, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus, should give you some clue just how closely and quietly obsessed with notions of enlightenment this text is. As I mentioned, Prometheus is the poster child of the Enlightenment, he who brought the gods' knowledge unto man, and Shelley saw fit to include him right there on the title, or alternate title at least. There's a little bit of behind the scenes humor going on there too. While it wasn't unheard of for books to have an or followed by a secondary title, there is this sly wink to the way in which the book was written, which was as part of a writing workshop or friendly contest at a lodge in Geneva, frequented by Mary Shelley, who wrote the book, her husband Percy, Lord Byron, and the lesser-known John Polidori. Now, Byron and Percy Shelley by this point are pretty much rock stars. Shelley really hasn't written that much, startlingly little, in fact, but he's already heralded by those in the know as the talent of a generation. In his private life, he married one 16-year-old girl and eloped with her before returning to England and meeting a 16-year-old Mary, now 5 years his junior, and eloping with her as his new bride, despite being already married. When Percy's first wife heard of his betrothal to Mary, she drowned herself, and this was naturally something that Mary struggled with a great deal. Now, Shelley's fame is nowhere close to Byron's, but it's rising quickly through association. Byron is suffering from scandal after scandal, owing money all over England, bedding actresses and giving and receiving all manner of venereal diseases from both male and female members of the extended royal family, and he hasn't even begun to peak. These guys are the new generation of romantics, the poets that believe in freedom and individuality and the ideals of classical antiquity over the rationalism and order and collective good promoted by Enlightenment thinking. They're concerned with the natural world and the sublime and the innate goodness of man, and at this point in their lives, really, they are full-on celebrities. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, because it's important to establish the kind of circles these guys are moving in, the sort of people and groups that would have been known to them. And it's safe to say they were part of the new cutting edge of culture and well known among their peers, with their peers and current events well known to them. So, while away fleeing scandal and on a European tour of sorts, Percy Shelley and his wife Mary take an extended vacation at a lodge in Geneva, currently rented by their friend Lord Byron, who is fleeing debtors and the increasing ire of the British royal family. And with him is his associate and physician, essentially full-time venereal disease checker, John Polidori. And one night, while they stayed up during a storm, Byron suggested they should play a game of sorts. They would each write a horror story to try to unsettle the others. They would then read each story aloud and all decide on a winner. They took a few days to each work on their story before coming together to see the results. Lord Byron told his story aloud, and he called it, very self-knowingly, The Fragments of a Novel. But later, John Polidori would adapt it into a novella called The Vampire, which would become the leading influence for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Not entirely, but essentially giving birth to the modern interpretations of the vampire myth. Mary Shelley brought forth the only thing in the world that could possibly top that, an essentially complete Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. She's not just creating one of the most enduring novels of all time, one of the most iconic figures in horror of all time, she's also essentially giving birth to the science fiction genre, and arguably even zombies too. If the legend is to be believed, there were some small edits made to the manuscript by Percy after the fact, but for the most part the work remained the same. Critics argue on how much input he actually had, some arguing that he had no input beyond lending his name to help get it published. Mary Shelley was a woman after all, and there were many ceilings left to break through. It was originally published anonymously, and her name wouldn't actually appear on the cover until a second edition was printed 5 years later. Other critics argue that he actually helped far more and that his fingerprints are visible in the writing at several points. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this discussion. What is an important takeaway from this is that, firstly, Percy Shelley was involved, even just by being around Mary, in the subject matter of the book, because Percy Shelley was very much aware of Weishaupt and the Illuminati, quite interested and animated by it at this point in his life, in fact. We know this primarily because by this point, Adam Weishaupt's notoriety had grown large enough that he was known throughout Europe, despite living now in shame and exile, but also very directly, as I'll get to in a moment. In the decades following his exile, Weishaupt had become infamous in his exploits. He was discussed in hushed tones in taverns and clandestine whispers in salons throughout Europe. He was an underground hero to a certain brand of intellectual, favouring progression above all else, and he was an anti-hero to others, banished by the establishment while still managing to leave an indelible mark on thousands of writers, academics, artists and intellectuals in Germany and its neighbouring countries, exactly the circles that a decade or two later the Shelleys find themselves mixing in. While we cannot say for certain exactly how many degrees of separation there were between Weishaupt, the Illuminati and the Shelleys, given their collective range of influence and the relatively close historical distance, the answer is likely somewhere between some and almost none. We can say in all likelihood that they would have heard of Weishaupt just in terms of his general infamy in Europe, regardless of everything else that I'm about to show you. Because the dissolution of the Illuminati and Weishaupt's banishment from Bavaria aren't necessarily the end for the secret society. Now, there are a great many different arguments as to who goes where and who does what. A lot of them have since been disproved. But one of the prevailing theories, again widely regarded as conspiracy now, but widely accepted at the time, was that Weishaupt's Illuminati had played a key role in instigating the French Revolution, primarily through a group known as the Jacobin Club, or more commonly, the Jacobins. Now, to put it very simply, the French Revolution was instigated by a lot of very angry poor people that were tired of living in a literal hell, and some even angrier middle-class people that were tired of living under the monarchy. The Jacobins were a French political club made up of that middle class, and they played a key role in the violent transition of power. The fallout from the French Revolution was enormous, but with every other major power in Europe terrified it was about to happen to them, and the primary reason for that was Illuminati hysteria. You see, a couple of years following the storming of the Bastille, a writer by the name of Abbé Augustin Barruel cited Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati as the real puppet masters of the French Revolution, making the suggestion that the Jacobin Club had found its beginnings as a trickle-down group of the Illuminati, furthering its aspirations into other countries, and even ascribing Ingolstadt as the place where the Jacobin Club found its spiritual beginnings. The work by Barruel quickly soared in popularity, so much so that its critics had to take the conspiratorial text seriously in order to attempt arguing back against it. Freemason societies all over Europe came out condemning it as fiction, fearing what it would mean for them if it were thought to be fact. But before long, other freethinkers began adding to the topic as well, bringing their own accounts and evidence of Illuminati conspiracies and building on Barruel's work. Most notably among them was natural philosopher John Robeson, who in his text Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of the Freemasons, Illuminati and reading societies, again placed the majority of the blame for the violent revolution squarely at the feet of Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati, and who again warned of it happening in other countries throughout Europe, just as Barruel had. The two writers in fact had many similarities in their arguments and conclusions, and their book spawned an anti-enlightenment and anti-revolution discussion throughout Europe that was constructed on these theses. Another influential text, Alexandre Dumas' Joseph Balsamo, is directly concerned with the Illuminati meeting in a ruined castle to plot the overthrowing of the French monarchy. Now, unlike the others, this was a novel, although clearly based on the swirling rumours about Illuminati involvement in the French Revolution, and so this too became wildly popular, and at the very least, an accepted part of the mythos by a good portion of the public. Conservatives, in Britain especially, but again throughout Europe, took this as gospel, primarily because it highlighted two groups they already envisioned as potential instigators for rebellion, namely women and the Irish. One of the figures singled out as a possible female agitator by this was Mary Wollstonecraft, an enormously influential early figure in feminism, who just so happened to be the mother of Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft died due to complications from giving birth to Mary Shelley, in fact, and it's pretty difficult to imagine a world where Mary Shelley isn't firmly aware and engaged by the Illuminati conspiracies, not only currently gripping Europe, but that led to the direct accusation of her deceased mother, a woman she carried immense guilt for. In 1798, the Irish Rebellion occurred, and this further convinced conservatives throughout Europe and the New World that groups were working in secret to overthrow them. How convinced they actually were is up for debate, but they certainly saw it as an opportunity to cull the parts of Enlightenment progression they didn't like. The move beyond organized religion and revolution against enforced structures of power that German and French philosophers promoted primarily, but also as a way of leaning into the Enlightenment ideals that they did support that stemmed primarily from British philosophers. Now, we have to be careful when we talk about what people in the past believed. By the time Shelley writes Frankenstein, many people are aware of these theories as conspiracy, and placing direct blame on Adam Weishaupt for the French Revolution is misguided at best given everything we know. But truth is a funny thing. And while all of this is widely accepted as conspiracy theory now, there's also a great deal of likelihood that ideas, members, motivations did pass from group to group and area to area, generation to generation. Ideas are difficult to stop once they get going, and no matter the provable links between a very secret society with a large number of unnamed and influential members and a very widespread revolution that occurred next door, it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this debate. One way or another, the links between those groups exist, no matter how tacitly. And not only was Mary Shelley personally aware of them, pretty much all of Europe was too. And aware is perhaps even too soft a word for the Shelleys. In fact, we have conclusive evidence that they were politically and philosophically engaging with these ideas in a public setting. We know from extensive research on the writing of Frankenstein that while they were at the lodge in Geneva, they both read and wrote about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the so-called intellectual father of the French Revolution, and we'll get back to him later on. Indeed, they are described as studying the French Revolution and its surrounding authors personally and extensively. Not only that, but another close friend of the Shelleys had just published a work titled The Memoirs of Prince Alexei Heimatov, which directly discusses and expands on the so-called Illuminati conspiracy currently gripping Europe. Not only that, but Percy Shelley was himself vocal in his support for Weishaupt's motives, namely, To secure to merit its just rewards, to the weak support, to the wicked the fetters they deserve, and to man his dignity, by freeing all men from the slavery imposed by society, governments, the sciences, and false religion. In fact, Percy's obsession with these ideas didn't end there. He wrote responses to and frequently read aloud at dinner parties from John Barrowell's Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism, the text I discussed previously that kicked off the Illuminati hysteria throughout Europe. The curious thing was that what constituted damning criticism on Barruel's part, Percy read with wonder at what people were on the brink of achieving. Whether ironically or innocently, Percy seemed to completely misunderstand Barruel's point and instead saw the text as a celebration of the revolutions to come, the path to the revolution of utopian idealism that he had always fantasized about. Percy, an early adopter of vegetarianism, had at first preached non-violence in all forms, speaking out regularly against the dangers of revolution a few years prior. But by this point in his life, he had begun to see exceptions to this rule, such as the Irish Rebellion, and he changed his stance on anarchical violence for the sake of positive systemic change, or, put simply, revolution. It's also worth mentioning that, although it's never been proven that any of them were fully fledged lodge members, both of the Shelleys had tacit links to Freemasonry, and Byron even more so, especially later on in his life. It's likely, given what we know, that opposing philosophical ideas were likely the cause of them not joining these groups, but they were most certainly known to one another. So first and foremost, I think hopefully in all that, we have established that Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, the two people who have creative input on the text, both absolutely know about Adam Weishaupt, the Illuminati, and the growing conspiracies of Illuminati influence, leading to potential and actual revolutions around Europe. Not only that, but we can say for certain that their lives were closely intertwined with it. They're avid readers of the literature surrounding it. They discuss it in social settings. Mary's mother has been vilified in the House of Commons because of it. Their friends are publishing manuscripts about it. And so I hope by now that I've proven that the Illuminati and the surrounding conspiracies, particularly the French Revolution, were actually an obsession of the Shelleys, desired or not. For Percy, they were exactly what he'd been waiting for. His revolution had always been one of ideas, and he'd finally found a set of ideas that he could fully align himself with, those of Weishaupt. Those of revolution and an end to the institutions that he viewed as tyrannical for the betterment of mankind. And Mary's life had been equally consumed, perhaps even more so, given the unhappiness she'd grown up with. Not only did this conspiracy of revolution lead in part to the vilification of her mother, but such ideals were a major contributing factor to her strained relationship with her father, William Godwin. Godwin was a divisive character, equally obsessed with revolution and the more extreme edge of Enlightenment ideas. When revolution began in France, he wrote on it with optimistic praise, and many of Mary's political leanings were inherited from her parents, primarily her father. But it's safe to say that Mary had reservations regarding them, and the human cost of the ideals that her father promoted. Whatever reservations Mary felt towards Godwin were not shared by Percy. As far as Percy was concerned, Godwin was royalty and he idolized him. He shared his views on everything from free love to political control to the tyranny of religion. Views that were essentially taken to their logical conclusion in Weishaupt's vision of the Illuminati. This meant that whether she liked it or not, these are the opinions that Mary was surrounded with. From her youth growing up as Mary Godwin to her life as a young woman named Mary Shelley. She really had no escape, and this often led to very unhappy moments in her childhood and quiet resentment or reservation towards some of these ideas. Reservations that were compounded by the enormous violence that occurred during the French Revolution, and reservations that she puts into words in Frankenstein. And that's the second major thing that we need to establish. Not just that Mary was aware of all this and an active participant in the surrounding discussion, but also, and this is essential, that Mary was pulling on her contemporary experiences to write a contemporary horror story. She's on holiday in Geneva and in love with the scenery, and subsequently Geneva is where she sets Victor's childhood. She needs a location marked with mystery and magic and medicine and chooses Ingolstadt, a location that by this point was steeped in gossip and unease surrounding the recent banishment of the Order of Illuminati. She needed a main character as her mascot for the perils of the Enlightenment, and she drew, in part at least, from Adam Weishaupt, a figure almost certainly known to her, shrouded in mystery, pushing forward exactly the ideas that she sought to condemn. And maybe condemn is too strong a word here, perhaps problematize is better. She sought to show the conclusion of such dangerous experiments with mankind's future, the cost of life, and so on. To be clear, she wasn't necessarily against the Enlightenment. She was, after all, a product of it, a ubiquitous participant within it, but it's easy to see why she would choose to write it from the critical Gothic lens that Frankenstein uses. It was a horror story after all. It was meant to make you uneasy, and from her standpoint, unchecked science and revolutionary philosophy designed to forever change how we live were things that most definitely had their downsides. So again, Shelley was writing her own experiences here. Her interest in the Enlightenment and dislike for some of its teachings went beyond Byron and Percy's romantic idealism. This wasn't written as any kind of exclusive protest towards her father or Percy. It was written from her own anxieties regarding the political and cultural climate in Europe and what was going to happen in its future. And that, true or not, stemmed in large part from concerns about what Adam Weishaupt had started in Ingolstadt all those years ago. Even the notion of galvanism, of the reanimation of corpses through electric shock, was something both the contemporary scientific community and the Shelleys had a keen interest in at the time. In fact, in her foreword to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Mary discusses hearing Byron and Shelley having a conversation about it behind closed doors while they were staying at their lodge in Geneva. Even the idea of grave-robbing corpses for the purposes of these reanimation events, just like it occurs in the text and the wider Frankenstein mythos, this was something she was both interested in and plucked straight from her travels. Before arriving in Geneva, the Shelleys had toured down through the mountains of southern Germany and the Rhine Valley, not too far away from Ingolstadt, past a certain centuries-old castle going by the name of Frankenstein. And during that period, rumours abounded, rumours the Shelleys were no doubt aware of as prevailing local gossip, of a strange alchemist called Johann Conrad Dippel, a somewhat controversial figure rumoured to have robbed graves and experimented on corpses up at Frankenstein Castle. Not only that, but legends also followed that there was at one point some kind of monstrous human cannibal using the castle as a base of operations. Dippel claimed to have found a way to extend his life through alchemy, suggesting he would live until at least 135. He unfortunately fell slightly short of that, dying at 61, just under halfway to his prediction. But he also claimed to be able to reanimate the dead, and I quote here, Dippel was convinced he could bring a body back to life by injecting it with a concoction of blood and bone, often made from mammal and human corpses. In Frankenstein the novel, Victor uses animal bone to assist in the building of his creature. So I'm sure some of you are saying, oh shit, well, isn't that all the inspiration we needed? That's pretty much the plot of the book right there. And you'd be right, essentially, the face level of the novel, at least, that's most of the moving parts covered. But that legend is pretty thin on the ground. I've just covered most of the details of it. It's certainly not one of the finest pieces of literary fiction ever written, like Frankenstein happens to be. So while a lot of the face elements of the story are adopted from one or two folktales Mary may have passed, the actual meaning, the underlying message, what Mary wanted to say, to write about, was something far more complex. All that really happened in the Rhine Valley with Dippel and Castle Frankenstein was that she found a good framework to tell her real story in. And for what it's worth, she claimed to get a lot of those elements from a nightmare. Certainly the vision of the reanimated and stitched together monster she describes, it's almost like a night terror in quite vivid detail. But again, what's really important here is that it's yet more evidence for the pile that Mary was pulling from of her lived experiences to write the novel. So if we accept that Percy and Mary are heavily engaged with contemporary theories regarding the extended influence of the Illuminati, and it's also very clear that Mary is pulling from her contemporary experiences to create Frankenstein, then it should not be too far-fetched that this is one of the experiences or topics that she pulls from. So now that's established, let's look at what's actually in the book that relates to Weishaupt as clues for further confirmation, and then what Mary Shelley's ultimate meaning was here and why she chose to involve all of this. So first up is the decision to set a large chunk of the book in Ingolstadt, Bavaria. Now, I've covered the base motivation behind this, but let's quickly look in a little bit more detail because it's an important part of the puzzle. So for the most part, the settings, locations, even character names are set in places Mary has visited, or at least brushed past. We have the influence of Castle Frankenstein and the brooding forests, the beautiful Swiss countryside of Geneva, the academically driven childhood marked by tragedy. And then we have Ingolstadt, somewhere Mary had been close to but had never actually visited, but somewhere that was singularly important to her because of what it represented. A mysterious place that gave birth to dangerous ideas, ideas that had impacted her life, her family's life, and countless lives of those around her. Perhaps in whisper, even the birthplace of revolution. Everywhere else, everything else in the core story that I've mentioned up until now had some direct link to Mary's lived experience. Even the idea of an alchemist reanimating the dead at a castle called Frankenstein. Everything except Ingolstadt. That was a decision necessitated by the meaning, the subtextual, everything hidden from the immediate view that she wanted to instill in the work. And that is why, out of all this, the best documented and peer-reviewed element is that Mary chose Ingolstadt precisely because it was the birthplace of the Order of Illuminism and the home of Adam Weishaupt. Frankenstein creates his monster there precisely because that is where Weishaupt created the Illuminati. And if you're thinking, well, if that's the case, then surely Frankenstein is Weishaupt and the monster is the Illuminati, then well done. That's a very handsome point you've just made. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are a couple more locations in the book that I deliberately haven't mentioned yet that really bring this theory into the realm of, at least in my opinion, the undeniable. And we need to look at them in conjunction with what the monster represents. So for now, let's stick with Ingolstadt, because despite absolutely being present in the text due to Weishaupt and the Order of Illuminism, there's also several other factors adding meaning behind this decision. I mentioned the mystery and dark brooding magic of the southern German forests, but it's worth mentioning that this is something that long precluded Weishaupt's short reign of infamy. Like any brooding location with a long history, it was no stranger to folk stories and things that go bump in the night. In fact, the area, and much of Germany, is synonymous with the birth and evolution of fairy tales and the dark forests that so often frequented those stories. But perhaps more relevant to the Shelleys, the literary history of Ingolstadt also played a role in the occultism and mystery the area seems steeped in. I am speaking about Johann Georg Faust, a German folk character / real person that was interested in alchemy and occultism, who popped up around Ingolstadt in the 1400s, claiming to have achieved a great many wondrous things, like leading the German army to victory through magical intervention. Eventually, he gained enough notoriety that the church accused him of being in league with the devil, leading to his exile from Ingolstadt. Details around his death are conflicting, but all seem to concur that it was a violent end at the hands of some kind of spectacular alchemical substance. Whatever the case, Faust's exploits and escapades quickly grew more fantastical and supernatural as gossip spread, and eventually they were popularized by the Christopher Marlowe play The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus, in which the titular character makes a deal with a demon named Mephistopheles, or Mephistopheles as we now know him. This is why we refer to a deal with the devil as a Faustian bargain. This play is still part of every medieval literature course going, so two well-educated literati like the Shelleys were undoubtedly well acquainted with it. Far more contemporary to the Shelleys though, the German playwright Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote the play Faust on the same subject, and it is likely they may have even seen it performed. Whatever the case, it's certain that Faust was also a massive attributing factor to the myth and legends of dark magic that surrounded Ingolstadt. And Ingolstadt was also home to a prominent university, one made somewhat notorious by being the breeding ground for the Illuminati. But it was also a relatively well-known medical school, and that was not only a key element required in the narrative, but also at that time meant one of two things: grave robbing for medical experimentation, or rumours of grave robbing for medical experimentation. Not only was it a perfect fit for the narrative, but it was another element of the uncanny, an extremely popular trope in Gothic literature, essentially where something is an extra level of creepy or unsettling because of how it may ring true with actual anxieties in real life. For example, a waxwork doll is uncanny because it reminds you of the blank, unthinking human figure. It's familiar and perverse at the same time. In the case of Frankenstein, grave robbing was a major anxiety for a long time, but especially during this Enlightenment era boom in underground autopsy for scientific advancement. But here we see it taken to its most ghoulish conclusion as Shelley uses those existing anxieties about grave robbing and odd experiments into reanimation as fuel for her grave robbing mad scientist. So that's the setting covered for now. Let's move on to Victor Frankenstein, specifically Victor Frankenstein as potentially being analogous with Adam Weishaupt. Now I need to give a disclaimer here. When we're analysing film, TV, but literature and poetry especially, it's important to remember that double, triple, quadruple meanings abound. When we write motifs and metaphors are often simply not just one thing. We put all of ourselves at once into it, sometimes even without intention, and so with good writers, tremendous writers like Mary Shelley, there's a lot of ascribed meaning rolled up into an often very tight narrative. And really what I mean by that is the main thing we can do wrong when analysing is to say something is definitely one thing. It's okay to say Frankenstein is a metaphor for the Illuminati. It is not okay to say Frankenstein is only a metaphor for the Illuminati. The difference is presuming the author can only mean or think one thing at a time, which in the case of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein is most certainly not accurate. In fact, she is absolutely masterful in how she weaves her anxieties together here into something that is undeniably new and at first impossible to decipher in all its layers of meaning. As a quick example, Frankenstein and the monster could represent, say, the enslaved state of man under God in a world full of pain and bereft of meaning. It could also, and likely does, in many ways represent Mary's guilt over being indirectly responsible for the deaths of two women, Percy's first wife and Mary's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And both of these things can be true. But what we can't say is that one of them is definitely true and therefore the other can't be. In short, things can, and inevitably do, mean more than one thing. So with that in mind, I don't just want to say Victor Frankenstein is Adam Weishaupt, and that's that, because to say only that would be inaccurate. Instead, I'm going to quickly whip through a bunch of other theories on Victor that are all almost definitely influencing or contributing factors to the character we see on that page. But then I'm also going to point out a few places that they fall down and stop working as theories in a way that the Weishaupt hypothesis doesn't seem to. I'm not saying that they're not accurate. What I'm saying is, while they all contribute meaning, perhaps the Adam Weishaupt and Illuminism connection is the clearest, best fitting central key to the whole puzzle. So first and foremost is, let's say, how we might explain it to someone in their formative years or first years of school. The most basic explanation we can offer. Victor Frankenstein represents science and scientific advancement. And this is actually supported in a very cool way in the text. As Victor takes us through his formative years, he relays the progression he takes through different branches of science. If we understand each year Victor describes as a century in real time, then what he is exactly describing is the timeline of scientific discovery in Europe. If we look at Victor from when he is 13 to 16, he becomes an ardent enthusiast of the 13th through 16th century alchemical writings of Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus. He becomes interested in the physical secrets of the world over understanding the moral relations of things, which quietly suggests towards the split that occurred in philosophy during this period of both moral philosophy and natural philosophy, the latter really being the starting point of what we recognize today as the academic sciences. It's during this period he develops an interest in magical remedies to the mortal condition that drive him to create the monster. And after a couple of years of that, as he approaches his 16th birthday, Victor is overcome with a sudden lack of faith in his study, representative of the skepticism movement in the 16th and 17th century. Following that, he finds a temporary enthusiasm in mathematics and the mathematical philosophy of nature, representing 17th and 18th century Cartesianism and Newtonianism. Elements like these are expertly hidden in the narrative, but undeniable once you see the meaning woven into them. And in a lot of senses, Victor does generally represent scientific endeavor, but nothing close to the direct analogy this passage suggests. On a surface level, this is Mary pointing out that Victor is a very learned young man, familiar with different trends and periods of scientific history. But to the astute reader, she's using that history to playfully align Victor's character with the route science has taken up until this point. But if we try to extrapolate any further, the message would be that science in the late 18th and 19th century found sudden success in galvanism and a reversion to previous attempts at alchemy. It also doesn't fit as soon as we have to explain what the monster represents, because there weren't any directly scientific experiments that led to some grand loss of life that might be being referred to here. It's a motif that's present at some points and at other points not. But if we look at those points where it does fall down, for example the reversion to alchemy following legitimate scientific study, then Weishaupt absolutely fits the bill. If we look at what the monster means in relation to Weishaupt, well, that's already pretty clear, the order of Illuminism, at least at first. So if we take the more advanced explanation, what you'd hope to see at college or university level, is that Victor represents the Enlightenment, essentially everything I covered at the start of the video, and in this sense the monster would be the following escalation of violence and suspected or actual revolution across Europe. And in my view, that's absolutely goddamn right. It just suffers a bit from ambiguity. In my opinion, it's much more accurate to say that Victor was representative of an amalgam of key figures and philosophies during the Enlightenment, but primarily based on one Adam Weishaupt of Ingolstadt, who creates a monster that is at first benign in its home in Ingolstadt, but becomes increasingly more murderous as it moves into Europe, morphing into ideas of violent revolution like we see in France. I'm not saying this prevailing theory is wrong, It just can and should be more accurate with the inclusion of Weishaupt, as I've just demonstrated. Because if we presume that Frankenstein is simply representative of the Enlightenment, which in broad strokes he is, there's still a lot of places the analogy falls down. As mentioned, we have Victor reverting to alchemy after completing his more traditional scientific studies. This was enough to get you laughed out of any learning academy in Europe by this point, but moreover the recalcitrance and sorrow that Victor shows for his creation. The French Revolution sent shockwaves through Europe, but they didn't signal some great change in consciousness when it came to the rhetoric being spewed. Far from it, every side of the philosophical debate used it as proof that their particular brand of enlightenment was the single right course for humanity, just as they had before. And as becomes a recurring theme, Adam Weishaupt fits that bill. He absolutely did feel sorrow and shame for the so-called monster he created. His time in exile was spent writing manuscripts on apologies for the Illuminati and what he would do differently. His tone often reaches the same levels of theatrical self-pity that we see in Victor. Really, it's not evidence that the prevailing theory is wrong, more that it's right. It's just that there's obvious clear ground still not being trampled if we don't include Weishaupt and simply say Enlightenment thinking. Weishaupt is the poster child for extreme Enlightenment thinking. His views are kind of the zenith of that idealism. And so to say Weishaupt is still saying the Enlightenment because he embodies it, but simply saying the Enlightenment removes Weishaupt from the equation, and he is a key part of this puzzle and clearly a direct influence for the character. Not to mention, without Weishaupt, the link to the monster being representative of blossoming revolution is tenuous at best. Again, it's not exactly inaccurate to say the French Revolution started because of the Enlightenment, but that's also a pretty broad and vague way of looking at it. Whereas Adam Weishaupt is directly implicated, and Europe at that time is currently swirling with anxieties and mysteries surrounding the remnants of his order of Illuminism and the conspiracy theories linking them to the Jacobins and the French Revolution. It's just more accurate, far neater, and it's firmly supported by the evidence. Another popular and working theory is that Percy was a major influence for Victor. In fact, we know he was influential on the character because Mary tells us as much. In her writings on Frankenstein, she discusses Percy's influence, how she brought parts of him into the character, the wild, most idealistic and dangerous parts of him that she'd seen once before in her father. Brilliant, but at times misguided and hungry for a revolution in human thinking. The other side of him, the loving and kind man that she at least thought she married, all those parts of him she wrote into the side character, Clerval. Loyal and friendly Clerval. But the troubled young man that demanded excellence from the world, that side of Percy she poured into Frankenstein. But these at time extreme ideals that Percy had grown into, while with him in some way throughout his life, were very much brought into focus by Weishaupt's ideologies. So while Percy's personal darkness is obviously individual to him, a lot of the more incendiary motivations he had, obsessions similar to those that Mary wrote into Frankenstein, well, they stemmed directly from Weishaupt's philosophies anyway. Like Victor, Percy had learned the sciences during his youth, and then made a reversion to alchemy and more esoteric studies. This is also true of Weishaupt, but there is a key distinction we need to make. Victor and Adam pursued alchemy and esotericism to find hidden but tangible and practical solutions to the mysteries and limits of the natural world. This was not really the case for Shelley, who didn't exactly spend time experimenting in a laboratory. To him, it was something different. In a manuscript he wrote discussing it, he likens alchemy to poetry, describing it as a bridge of sorts between reason and imagination. He's interested in alchemy as an attempt to answer the questions that conventional science fails to, but more from a spiritual angle of it representing those notions and the lineage they take all the way back to ancient mysticism. Not really in the practical sense that Victor or Dippel or Weishaupt were interested in. And for Mary, that spiritual relationship was likely an influencing factor as to why she chose to feature alchemy so prominently in the book, because it represented a romantic link to the mysticism and unknown of the ancient world, the corners of the world that still existed that science could not explain. The Enlightenment, intent on rationalism and forward thinking, put a great deal of stock in looking to the future, of building a better tomorrow. But as far as the Romantics were concerned, we had more to learn by looking back. They were obsessed with the myths and lifestyle of classical antiquity, of Greece and Rome, and they sought to move closer to that, spiritually and philosophically closer to a time where man was perceived to be more in tune with nature and the elements. This is exactly what Victor does when seeking answers to his quest for dominion over life. It's in part why why Percy Shelley was fascinated with alchemy and galvanism. The idea that the answers to life's greatest ills were hidden somewhere amongst the natural world, previously known by those now thought to be fools and charlatans. And most importantly, it's exactly aligned with Weishaupt's beliefs, who, like Percy Shelley and the Romantics, saw answers buried in the mysteries of the past. While he no doubt felt as though he shared a kinship with Prometheus, Weishaupt was equally smitten with Diogenes and the story of his lamp, another illumination motif in Greek literature that represents a quest for discovery. Another issue with the Frankenstein is Percy Shelley theory is again Frankenstein's deep regret over his creation. He doesn't stick vehemently to his principles as Percy did, or as Mary's father William Godwin did, despite showing the same fervent levels of obsession. Nor is he the rugged genius and heartthrob that Percy was. In fact, as those who've read the novel will know, Victor Frankenstein is a bit of a bitch. Everything fatigues him, or outright makes him faint. Despite finding beauty and joy in nature, he is entirely maligned by the world and his experiences within it. He's not in love with it, as Percy was. Victor privileges the pursuit of science over his family, and Percy did no such thing, although Mary's father perhaps did. Percy did absolutely privilege other women over his family, but that's another story. Most crucially though, Victor regrets his decisions, and sees the error of his ways, and that very aptly described Weishaupt, who spent his final years writing apologies for and revised versions of the Illuminati. There are many other aspects that don't align with Shelley, such as Victor's tragic childhood, that again absolutely do align with Weishaupt's early life. I think it's fair to say, and indeed Mary did, that Victor was influenced in parts by Percy, but I personally wouldn't go as far as saying Victor is an analogy for Percy, whereas I am pretty much saying that with Adam. So there are probably infinite other theories on what Victor might represent, but we've covered the main ones, some others I've mentioned in passing, but given that these are the theories that seem to fit best overall, there's not really much else we need to cover. To me, it seems pretty clear that while Frankenstein is absolutely a mishmash of influences, both personal and public, it's safe to say that if his character is a metaphor for anything or anyone, it's Adam Weishaupt. But if that's too far-fetched for you, just Enlightenment-era philosophy that led to revolution. But as I've pointed out, that doesn't fit quite as neatly, nor does it cover quite as much. Before we move on, there's a few more clues from the text that link Weishaupt to Frankenstein. First up is the initial reason I noticed an apparent link between Victor and Weishaupt, the brilliant academic whose personal life is marred by tragedy, burrowing into esoteric research in search of knowledge supposedly beyond man's reach. Specifically, the occultists and alchemists that Frankenstein makes use of first in his self-education, and then later on with his experiments into reanimation. Those being the 13th through 16th century alchemists Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus that I mentioned earlier, all of whom were German. Now, these texts were familiar to Percy, once his distant interest in alchemy had brought him to, because they were relatively well known, and for that reason, Mary was probably aware of them as well, and that's how we see them in the book. I have tried to research at length any mention of what esoteric texts Adam Weishaupt may have been using in the hopes of finding another possible link there. And there are some brief mentions. Two he definitely studied were the Kabbalah and the mysteries of the Seven Sages of Memphis, but these are more directly related to magic and spirituality. In terms of alchemy, we don't really have a bibliography, so there is a very small leap of faith here, but ultimately it is unlikely that Weishaupt, as well read on all things potentially mystical as he was, wasn't aware of these German alchemists and philosophers that he was geographically and historically far closer to than the Shelleys. These are pretty well-known works as far as alchemical texts go, possibly the most famous examples we have out of Germany. Put simply, it is difficult to envision a world where these weren't on Weishaupt's reading list at some point, probably quite early on in his research. I want to take a moment to point out how similar these men are in terms of voice, tone, and how they see the world also. Now, this could literally go on for hours just comparing and contrasting quotes from Victor and Adam, so I've just picked out a few key ones that kind of relate to their outlook on the world and their situation. I'm not saying for certain any of these are demonstrative of Shelley's intent. It's just interesting how closely aligned the two men are. So first up is the quote from Victor: "The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine," which is really just the best summary sentence for Victor's obsession with the understanding and mastery of the natural world, which I touched on briefly with his lack of care for moral philosophy and his decision to pursue natural philosophy. Prior to creating the monster, Victor's ultimate goal is to uncover the secrets of the natural world. And the quote from Weishaupt: "And all of illumination which human reason can give, none is comparable to the discovery of what we are, our nature." So again, pretty self-explanatory. The same is exactly true for Adam. He sees discovery of the natural world and mastery over the laws that govern it as the most important discoveries humanity could achieve. They essentially have the exact same obsession. Next up is a little trickier to understand without context. Victor's quote is, "Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome." Beautifully presented, but the meaning is slightly hidden given the older modes of language. Essentially, Victor is saying here that the obsessive nature of his work would be tiring under normal circumstances, but perhaps he was buoyed along in that work by something unseen and divine. Even simpler, this may have been impossible if I didn't have help from on high. And to move to Weishaupt, we have, "In another situation and in an active station in life, I should have been keenly occupied, and the founding of an order would never have come into my head." And then from a different passage, "Who would have thought that I was to be the founder of a new religion?" Now, Weishaupt is again suggesting that there was some kind of spiritual drive here behind his work, although he's being knowingly ironic given his open desire to end the tyranny of organized religion. But beyond that, men are using this notion of their ideas being influenced from on high to in some way negate blame on themselves, to make themselves some sort of accessory to a higher thought or force that may have worked through them. Although in Weishaupt's case, it's highly unlikely it was a Christian understanding of God. But this idea that they both created some pretty damaging ideas and tried to, in their arrogance, use this as a way to try and offset responsibility, while claiming, no matter how tongue-in-cheek, to be in some way divine, is remarkably similar, and is exactly in line with two men that would always choose self-pity over guilt and recalcitrance. Moving on from that one, we've got this pretty optimistic statement from Victor. "A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs." And that's grandiose talk, and again, really misguided given how the actual relationship between creator and new species plays out. This is absolutely Shelley setting Victor up for a grand kind of fall, and fall is absolutely meant in the divine sense here as well. The novel is obsessed with Paradise Lost. More importantly, Victor is having visions of grandeur here about being that creator figure to a new race or species of being. Now, in Victor's more fantastical case, that's actually quite accurate. The language is deliberately tilted to him being a creator, or essentially God figure to a new sect of man. And if we move over to Weishaupt, we have this pair of quotes. "I am proud to be known to the world as the founder of the Illuminati." And from later on, "The human race will then become one family, and the world will be the dwelling of rational men." Again, we see pretty much the exact same thing. Weishaupt sees himself as the founder of a new family, so again, the father/creator figure, and that family is essentially the new race of rational or illuminated men. He's also shown the same kind of hubris that Victor demonstrates in the predicted success of his misguided efforts. Another place they cross over is their inherent desire for secrecy in their actions. Both Victor and the frame tale of Walton that bookends the narrative are obsessed with the word secret and secrecy in general. Really, the book as a whole is. It's mentioned frequently and is obviously a large concern of Victor's given the illicit and grotesque nature of his work. And equally obsessed, if not more so, is Weishaupt, who wrote at length on the strengths of secrecy when it came to attaining power and influencing the minds of men. Again, the illicit nature of his work. And one last quote I want to draw your attention to here from Victor, just before we move on to the monster, is his final words. And that is, "Yet why do I say this? I have myself been blasted in these hopes, yet another may succeed." Now, Victor's hope at this point is that someone will bring an end to the reign of terror caused by the monster, given he is now dying and unable to pursue it any further. We're going to look closer at what that ending means shortly, but for now I just want to focus on the comparison between Victor and Adam. Just like Victor, Adam's later writings are quite self-questioning and let down. He's seen what his monster has accomplished once let free into the world, and it's far more violent than he could have imagined. But in the end, he finds solace in the next generation being able to succeed. In Victor's case, Walton represents the next generation of scientists, perhaps able to correct his mistakes. In Weishaupt's case, in his revisions or essentially second drafts for the Illuminati that he never really intended to carry out in practice, he more left them as plans for the future and for the trickling course of influence throughout Europe, the explosion for which he may very well have provided the tinder, albeit indirectly. They're extremely close in these parallels. Regretful old men whose faith in their own philosophy has been torn from them, now looking to the next generation to succeed where they have failed. So just to sum that up, from these comparisons, we've got this shared image of a man with a tragic family background in childhood, convinced of his own genius, at the university in Ingolstadt, hell-bent on secrecy in his work, refusing to second-guess his motivations through arrogance, with an obsession for discovering all the secrets of the natural world and the supernatural beyond that. The idea he's going to be some kind of creator figure for some kind of new sect of mankind. And as far as mistakes go, dodging responsibility through this notion that his actions were somehow guided by a higher power. ending up a bitter and regretful old man looking to the next generation to succeed where he has failed. And that is honestly a pretty specific character type. I can't say I know too many people like that in my personal life. And of course, I've cherry-picked quotes and similarities there rather than maybe focusing on trying to find differences that I could pull out. But that's also essentially how you go about making an argument for stuff like this, and if it fits, it fits. It's certainly not vague or overly broad in any way. It doesn't describe Percy, it doesn't describe Dipple, nor can such a specific outlook be easily or at all mapped onto another character in the text. In character arc, in character flaws, outlook, ideology, and outcome, Victor and Adam share an awful lot of similarities. Let's move on from Victor and onto his monster. Now, if we look at what the monster is traditionally seen to represent, we have the generally accepted answer of the seeds of revolution throughout Europe, which, just like Frankenstein representing Enlightenment ideals, is essentially very close to our Weishaupt Illuminati explanation, just slightly less refined. It's definitely accurate to say the monster represents the sparking of revolution across Europe, but it's probably more accurate to say the French Revolution as a direct product of the influence of the Illuminati. And just as when we looked at Victor, all of these broader elements of analysis tend to fall down at a certain point. If we say the monster is simply revolution through Europe, then why Ingolstadt, a place whose only real link to revolution was the swirling Illuminati-driven conspiracies surrounding the inception of the Jacobin Club? If it's simply the French Revolution, then why is the monster not just bloodthirsty from the get-go? It's also worth noting that despite doing its eventual fair share of killing, the monster spills no blood in Ingolstadt, just as the Illuminati's tenure there was extremely benign. It's only as the monster breaks loose from its creator and begins making its way across Europe that it becomes violent, perfectly in line with the Illuminati to Jacobin to French Revolution theories that were abounding at the time. It's also worth noting that the word illuminate in all its forms does not appear in the novel until the moment Victor sees the monster fully realized and ambulatory in Ingolstadt, after which it appears several times, further suggesting that this moment is representative of Weishaupt's birthing of Illuminism. So maybe the best way of looking at what the monster truly represents is the birth and benign starting point of the Illuminati in Ingolstadt, but when the monster leaves and begins his violent rampage across Europe, it becomes directly representative of the French Revolution. Not simply the seeds of revolution across Europe or the Illuminati hysteria that followed them, but directly the French Revolution. And even if you've read the book, that may sound like a pretty odd claim at first. So let's look at why critics all pretty much agree on this French Revolution theory. As well as the pattern I've just laid out, where the monster follows the route of benign Illuminati, Ingolstadt innocence to this vengeful violence of the proletariat in Paris, there are some pretty specific, definite clues that this is exactly what's happening. And now this comes first and foremost from the locations chosen for the novel that I haven't mentioned yet, but also the victims of the monster and where and how they're dispatched. So let's start by looking at locations. Now, I mentioned there's a frame tale around the main narrative. The book starts and ends with a failed rider come ambitious scientist, Walton, on a mission to navigate the Northwest Passage and find the magnetic North Pole. Setting off from St. Petersburg, Russia, they make their way towards the ice sheets when they catch a vision of a gigantic figure through the blizzard. Not long after, they find an aged Victor Frankenstein adrift on an ice floe after being stranded while in pursuit of the giant creature. Now, this section, out on the ice with Victor literally pursuing his monster to the ends of the earth, is by far my favourite sequence in the book, and something that almost never makes it into modern versions of the character. It's here we first meet Victor, right at the end of his story. He's on the verge of death, not only from exposure on the ice, but exhaustion and a broken mind and broken spirit driven to madness by his creation. But this St. Petersburg location is crucial, because if Ingolstadt was the spiritual birthplace of the French Revolution, St. Petersburg is where the French Revolution spiritually ended, where it went to die. Napoleon had risen to power during the revolution, winning campaign after campaign and constantly dancing a knife's edge to maintain his power. He was a phenomenal general that managed to raise one of the greatest fighting forces in history, his so-called Grand Army, which at its peak would number over 600,000 men conscripted at one time and over 2 million total conscripts. And with it, he seizes power and brings the revolution to its bloody conclusion. But for Napoleon and all those that rallied behind him in France, this was only the beginning. He declared war on many of the major powers around him, Britain, Spain, Russia and Austria, with a good deal of confidence about his military superiority. He saw much success in his campaigns in Europe, but it would all come tumbling down with his decision to march the Grand Army into Russia. In his arrogance, he envisioned being welcomed into St. Petersburg as their new emperor, lauded and cherished. This would not be the case. The French invasion of Russia is one of the most lethal operations in military history. As the Grand Army moved into Russia, it was met with fierce pockets of resistance, losing several key battles. But for the most part, the Russians continued to fall back, allowing the French to take large amounts of ground. The Russians knew the size of the French army. They also knew that logistically, it could not survive an extended campaign so far away from home in such a brutal climate. They allowed the French to keep spreading themselves thinner and thinner, even letting Moscow go without a fight, until eventually, isolated and freezing with his men dropping like flies, Napoleon had to give in and turn around. He never made it to St. Petersburg. It is estimated that of the 612,000 combatants who entered Russia, only 112,000 returned to France. While Napoleon would continue to fight off the British and Spanish armies with remarkable skill upon his return home, ultimately his crippling defeat at the hands of the Russian frontier ensured his defence was short-lived. Napoleon may have finally lost at Waterloo, but the spiritual end to the promises made by the French Revolution died out on that Russian ice. And that is where we find Walton, where we find Victor and the monster he pursues at the end of their violent journey. From Ingolstadt to St. Petersburg, it's the literal route from the beginnings of the Illuminati to the ends of the French Revolution. And that is pretty clear-cut. But there's a couple more locations still featured in the novel that make it even more undeniable. The first is the Plan Palais in Geneva, where the monster kills Victor's younger brother William. This reflects the site being home to 11 public political executions during the Revolution. And beyond that, however, the site also hosted 4 more executions in the next summer that were widely condemned due to those involved being sentenced to death with almost zero evidence of wrongdoing. And this is absolutely designed to reflect the death of Justine, William's nanny, whom the monster frames for the killing of William. Frankenstein doesn't speak out about the existence of the monster in fears of his own implication, and this leads to Justine being unfairly tried and executed, just as we saw during the French Revolution at Plan Palais. Just as we see with Ingolstadt and St. Petersburg, the Plan Palais was another location of great spiritual importance to the revolution. So much so, in fact, that shortly after Frankenstein is released, a statue is cast in Paris in honor of Rousseau and delivered to the Plan Palais. Rousseau is the guy I mentioned earlier that both Shelleys were fascinated with, that had become known as the intellectual father of the revolution. And it's in Rousseau that we find the philosophy that Mary is really trying to get at with Frankenstein. And I just want to point out here that in a lot of well-published works that link the monster to the revolution, this statue of Rousseau is cited as a primary reason for Mary choosing the Plan Palais. In reality, however, this does not make sense given that the statue's erection came a decade after the publication of Frankenstein. There was in fact a small obelisk there before that also honoured Rousseau's contributions to the revolution, and it's this obelisk that we know Mary was aware of because she wrote to her sister about visiting it 2 weeks before the contest at the lodge in Geneva. There is no doubt that Mary's decision to base the story and both William and Justine's deaths here exactly at the Plan Palais where the executions took place were designed to be reflective of the location's relevance to Rousseau and the revolution. As a quick side note, if you were to visit Plan Palais in more recent times, you will also see this statue of Frankenstein's monster right on the spot where he supposedly murders William. So that's cheery. And lastly, in terms of location, we have the setting of Ireland, where the monster springs up to murder Henry Clerval after its initial reign of terror on the European mainland. And this is again widely agreed upon by critics to represent the Irish Rebellion that came soon after the French Revolution. This is a very out-of-the-way decision to move events to Ireland, and really the Irish Rebellion offers the only explanation for this choice of location. So to quickly sum up, we have the creation of the monster / Illuminati in Ingolstadt, the wave of violence in Europe as the monster moves from benign to vengeful, mirroring the path of philosophy, moving from the Illuminati and other parallel groups, and into the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. The murder in Ireland signifying the Irish Rebellion there, and St. Petersburg as this spiritual place of ending, where Victor finds himself at the very ends of his own ambition, trapped out on the ice, dying as Napoleon's men had. The spiritual end to the revolution. And to get closer to Mary's ultimate meaning, we need to see the two main things that all these killings have in common. Firstly, there's a lot of indirect guilt on Victor's part. He is responsible for the murders only ever indirectly. He makes the monster and the monster kills people. And this is, as I've mentioned, reflective in some ways of Mary's guilt over the death of her mother and the suicide of Percy's displaced first wife, but also Weishaupt's suspected links to the era of violence and paranoia that followed him. More crucially than that, though, is that Shelley made certain that all of the people directly killed by the monster were innocent of any wrongdoing, and it is here that we find the root to her meaning. Firstly, the monster kills Victor's younger brother William, then frames Justine, William's nanny, for the murder. Clerval is killed in Ireland as the monster attempts to frame Victor for the crime. Following this, as Victor and his childhood sweetheart are about to be married, the monster kills her also. Shortly after that, Victor's father dies from essentially grief, and old age following the tragic course of events he's been forced to endure. All of the direct killings by the monster are aimed at the neck, essentially the monster pressing on the victim's windpipe, and Justine, who is framed, is killed by hanging. This is of course supposed to bring to mind the guillotine-driven decapitations of the French Revolution, and in Justine's case, the unjust executions that occurred at the Plan Palais. None of these victims are guilty of anything other than their proximity to Victor, because the monster's wrath is entirely related to Shelley's, and more crucially Rousseau's philosophy that whenever power is taken, it is the innocent that will suffer, and that whatever system takes power will undoubtedly find roots to evil and control of the innocent. Or as Rousseau puts it at its most simplest, that all human beings are naturally good, but society has imposed its evil ways upon them. The idea that social structures force us to live in a manner that is unnatural and in a hierarchical form that can do nothing but push cruelty downwards. Now, Shelley was an avid reader of Rousseau, but that's not to say she blindly agreed with everything he proposed. She was, after all, appalled with the senseless killing during the French Revolution, something that Rousseau had been a massive philosophical influence for. But she still saw immutable truth in his basic philosophies, that the lowest and most innocent of society would always suffer the worst from the hands of that society, that good men would always bear the cost of society's hierarchical power balance, and that good men who take power are likely to be corrupted by it. This whole novel, with all its myriadic influences and embellishments, is a protest to the fact that for all the talk of positive change, enlightenment and revolution, the main cost had still been the loss of innocent life, and that despite all the violent deposition of those on top, the majority of that cost had still been paid from the bottom up. And it all started with Adam Weishaupt, his obsession to know the unknown, and the creation of a monster that would far exceed his control. And there is also the subject of what the monster desires, and if you haven't read the book, then you're probably not anticipating quite how verbose and articulate this monster is. He reads Milton and laments his differences to Adam in the garden, and sees similarities in the creator figure that turns his back. He's a pretty complex dude. Again, something that almost never makes it into modern interpretations of the monster. For some reason we have this barely verbal brick man now. So he's pretty open about what he wants, and there's so much here that I'm not touching on because it's a very complex book. Death and damnation and eternal salvation, all the elements of gothic horror and what it means to be a man that the creature works through. But if we were trying to sum up in as few words as possible what that monster wants, then liberté, égalité, fraternité may not be all that far from the reality. The monster initially wants to be loved by his creator, but he certainly has every desire to be a free man. He certainly views himself as being cast out of Eden, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a strong sense and desire for his own freedom. So that's liberty checked off. Once he realizes his place in the world, the Adam of a new species so monstrous even he is disgusted by himself, then he becomes increasingly concerned with his place next to the human race, being accepted and equal to man. And we see this play out as he spies on and tries to interact with the farming family. So there's equality. Really, liberty and equality are his two main concerns, both stemming from the unfair and uncaring treatment he receives from Victor and other humans. But lastly comes fraternity, which is exactly why the creature torments Victor and kills his friends. He's demanding that Victor make him a bride, as he made the monster originally, so that the monster may know companionship and love. He wants freedom, to be treated as an equal, and to be loved at least by his kin. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the mob motto of the French Revolution. Now, before we close out here, there is a small side character I haven't mentioned so far that has some further relevance to the Illuminati theory. I'm referring to one of Victor's tutors, the gentleman known as Monsieur Waldman. This is a guy that catalyzes Victor's interest in alchemy and is described in fairly kind terms, with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. Some critics have suggested that Waldman is a stand-in for Weishaupt, both convinced that alchemy was a precursor to natural science. They share a similar visage, and there's a certain degree of mirroring to their second names. I'm not against this theory really, it's more fuel for the fire that Weishaupt and the Illuminati are major influences on the text. And he does pass his love of alchemy and esoteric teachings on to Victor, as Percy had received them from Weishaupt. But if we imagine Victor as a biographical account of Weishaupt, albeit metaphorical, then relative to that biography, Waldman would be a well-meaning political cartoon about him. There isn't a great deal of depth or exploration to his character, and there aren't nearly as many parallels as I've laid out with Victor. It could well be, in fact it's likely, that this influencing figure on Victor's life was influenced by Weishaupt. But Victor is more of a direct metaphor for Weishaupt in my opinion, and the illumination of knowledge that occurs in Ingolstadt. There are also a couple of other well-known figures like James Lind and Davy that critics suggest were the influence for Waldman, and these do seem like quite likely fits also. So most best guesses see the character as an amalgamated figure built from these influences. And that, I think, is everything. I hope I've convinced you, and I absolutely encourage you to go read the text and do your own research on the matter. I'll put a reading list in the description for anyone that's interested, but I will say that over the course of putting this together, I've become more and more convinced by the theory. And really, it's the accepted readings plus an extra bit, so that makes sense. It fits the truth, it fits the text, and it's curious to me that it's not something that's been discussed more already. Let me know what you think down below. Love discussing this stuff in the comments with you guys. If you're new here and you want to give me a subscribe, then that would be amazing. This is a weird kind of video for me, the sort of literary conspiracy, but funnily enough, it's actually the reason I made this channel, which is another thing I want to say. Because when I was at university and this actually got published, I sort of stumbled on another more recent and terrifying conspiracy hidden in a well-known piece of literature. And I really want to make a video on that. It was my first idea for the channel ever, but I didn't want to put it out at 0 subscribers and have no one see it. So if this video does well, then I think I will go ahead and put it together. If not, I'll wait a little bit longer because it really is something that's important to me. Next up, video-wise, there's a quick no-script ramble about Arcane and the current flourishing state of animation, just as something I could put out more quickly. And then in very short order after that, you will get the complete guide to Hereditary, I promise. I've actually just recorded voiceover for 5 different videos, those 3 that I just mentioned, and then 2 more for my second channel, and there's loads more coming right after that. I apologize for my absence, but I firmly intend to make up for it. See you very soon, guys. Peace.